What happens when a routine school field trip becomes a descent into living nightmare? When trusted teachers lead unsuspecting students not to enlightenment, but to terror beyond imagination? How many children never came home from field trips that seemed perfectly normal on paper, their disappearances explained away by tragic accidents and unfortunate coincidences? In the autumn of 1987, 32 eighth graders from Lincoln Middle School in rural Pennsylvania boarded a yellow bus for what their permission slips described as an educational outdoor experience. Only 28 would return, and those who did would never speak of what they witnessed in the abandoned mining town of Centralia. The permission slip had seemed innocent enough. "Dear parents," it read, "your child has been selected to participate in an advanced geology field study. We will be visiting historical mining sites to observe real-world applications of earth science principles discussed in class. The trip will last from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. and includes lunch. Please ensure your child brings appropriate outdoor clothing and a water bottle." Mrs. Henderson had been teaching 8th grade science at Lincoln Middle School for 15 years, and her field trips were legendary among students and parents alike. She had a gift for making learning come alive, whether she was leading kids through the Philadelphia Museum of Natural History or having them collect water samples from local streams. Parents trusted her completely, never questioning her destinations or methods. That trust would prove fatal for some of their children. The morning of October 15, 1987, dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of golden autumn light that made everything seem possible. 32 students gathered in the school parking lot, their breath visible in small puffs as they chatted excitedly about the day ahead. Most had never been to a real mining site, and the promise of exploring underground tunnels felt like the adventure of a lifetime. Sarah Chen was among those students, a quiet but curious girl who loved geology almost as much as Mrs. Henderson did. She'd spent the previous evening reading about coal mining in Pennsylvania, eager to impress her favorite teacher with her knowledge. Her best friend Marcus Williams bounced beside her, his usual energy amplified by the excitement of missing regular classes. "I heard we might even see some old mining equipment down there," Marcus whispered as they boarded the bus. "Like the stuff they used in the 1800s. Sarah nodded, clutching her geology notebook. She'd prepared a list of questions about sedimentary rock formation and coal deposits, hoping to turn this field trip into extra credit that might boost her grade average. College was still years away, but Sarah already dreamed of studying geology at Penn State. Mrs. Henderson stood at the front of the bus as the last student climbed aboard, her usually warm smile seeming somehow different in the morning shadows. She'd been acting strangely for the past few weeks ever since she'd received that mysterious phone call during lunch period. Several students had noticed her staying late after school, poring over maps and making notes in a leather journal she'd never used before. "Good morning, everyone," she called out as the bus engine rumbled to life. "Today we're going to see something truly special. We'll be visiting sites that most people never get to experience, places where the earth itself tells the story of our region's industrial heritage." The drive took longer than expected. What should have been a 2-hour journey stretched to nearly 4 hours as Mrs. Henderson directed the bus driver down increasingly remote roads. The landscape changed from familiar suburban developments to dense forests, then to abandoned farmland scattered with the skeletons of old buildings. "Are we lost?" asked Jenny Morrison, a popular girl who'd only signed up for the field trip because her friends had. "Not lost," Mrs. Henderson replied, her voice carrying an odd note of anticipation. "Just taking the scenic route. Sometimes the most educational experiences are found off the beaten path." By noon, they'd reached what Mrs. Henderson announced as their destination, the ghost town of Centralia. Most of the students had never heard of it, but Sarah remembered reading about it in one of her geology magazines. Centralia was famous for the underground coal fire that had been burning beneath the town since 1962, a slow-motion disaster that had eventually forced the evacuation of nearly all residents. What Sarah didn't know was that Mrs. Henderson had been corresponding for months with Dr. Emil Reeves, a former mining engineer who claimed to have discovered something extraordinary in Centralia's abandoned tunnels. His letters, written in spidery handwriting on yellowed paper, spoke of geological formations unlike anything in the scientific literature, of caverns that seemed to exist outside normal physical laws, of sounds and movements in the deep places that suggested Centralia's coal fire was the least of its secrets. The bus pulled into what had once been the town's main street. Most of the buildings had been demolished years earlier, leaving only foundations and the occasional standing structure to mark where a community had thrived for over a century. Steam rose from cracks in the asphalt, visible evidence of the fire still burning in the coal seam far below. "Remember, everyone," Mrs. Henderson announced as they disembarked. "Stay close to the group at all times. The ground here can be unstable, and there are dangerous gases in some areas. We'll be following a very specific route that's been deemed safe for educational purposes." The students gathered around their teacher, 32 young faces bright with curiosity and excitement. They had no way of knowing that Dr. Emil Reeves was waiting for them in the ruins of the old company store, or that his definition of educational purposes differed dramatically from what their parents had imagined. Dr. Reeves appeared as they approached the store's crumbling facade, emerging from the shadows like something that had been waiting there for decades. He was a tall, gaunt man in his 70s, with wild white hair and eyes that seemed to reflect light in an unsettling way. His clothes were old-fashioned and dusty, as if he'd been living underground for years. "Mrs. Henderson," he called out, his voice carrying an accent that none of the students could quite place. "And these must be your eager young geologists. Welcome to Centralia, children. Welcome to one of the most geologically active sites in North America." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Something about Dr. Reeves made her skin crawl, though she couldn't articulate why. Maybe it was the way his gaze lingered on each student, as if he were cataloging them. Or perhaps it was the strange implements she glimpsed through the broken windows of the company store, devices that looked more like medieval torture instruments than geological equipment. Dr. Reeves has been studying Centralia's unique geological features for over 30 years, Mrs. Henderson explained to her students. He's graciously agreed to guide us through some areas that are normally off-limits to visitors. Marcus raised his hand. "Is it safe? I mean, with the underground fire and everything?" Dr. Reeves smiled, revealing teeth that were far too sharp for a normal human mouth. "Safety is relative, young man. Every geological expedition involves some degree of risk. But I promise you'll see things today that no other students have ever witnessed. Things that will expand your understanding of what's possible beneath our feet." The group followed Dr. Reeves away from the main road, down a path that seemed to wind deeper into the earth with each step. The air grew warmer and more oppressive, thick with the smell of sulfur and something else. Something organic and unpleasant that reminded Sarah of roadkill left too long in the sun. The coal seam fire, Dr. Reeves explained as they walked, was officially started by accident in 1962. A trash fire spread to an exposed coal seam, they say. But that's not the whole truth. The fire merely awakened something that had been sleeping in these tunnels for much longer than anyone imagined. Mrs. Henderson nodded along with his words, her expression wrapped with the kind of fervor usually reserved for religious experiences. Several students exchanged glances, beginning to feel that this field trip was taking a decidedly strange turn. They reached what appeared to be the entrance to an old mine shaft, though it had been modified in ways that seemed to defy both engineering principles and common sense. The opening was larger than it should have been, carved into shapes that hurt to look at directly. Strange symbols were etched into the rock around the entrance, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed peripherally. "This is the Brennan Shaft," Dr. Reeves announced. Officially sealed in 1964 due to fire danger. Unofficially, it provides access to geological formations that predate human civilization by millions of years. Several students began to look genuinely nervous. Tommy Kowalski, a boy known more for his athletic ability than his academic performance, spoke up. "Maybe we should head back. This doesn't look safe." Mrs. Henderson's response was sharp, so different from her usual patient demeanor that several students actually flinched. We've come too far to turn back now, Thomas. Doctor, Reeves has spent considerable time preparing for our visit. The least we can do is show some appreciation for his expertise. Dr. Reeves had produced several battery-powered lanterns from somewhere, though Sarah couldn't remember seeing him carry them. The devices looked old and unreliable, their beams casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of their light sources. Each student will be paired with a partner, Dr. Reeves instructed. We'll be descending in groups of 4 with adequate supervision at all times. Mrs. Henderson will lead the first group, and I'll bring up the rear to ensure no one gets left behind. The pairing process revealed the first clear sign that something was wrong. Instead of allowing students to choose their own partners, Dr. Reeves seemed to be selecting them based on criteria that made no sense. He separated best friends, split up the more outgoing students, and grouped the quieter children together in ways that would minimize their collective ability to resist or call for help. Sarah found herself paired with Amanda Walsh, a shy girl she barely knew. Marcus was matched with Bobby Chen, no relation to Sarah despite the shared surname, while Jenny Morrison was grouped with Patricia Gonzalez. The pairing seemed random, but there was a method to Dr. E. Reeves's selections that would become clear only later. The first group to enter the mine shaft included Mrs. Henderson, Dr. Reeves, and 8 students. They disappeared into the darkness with their flickering lanterns, their voices echoing back for a few minutes before being swallowed entirely by the earth. The remaining 24 students waited outside, growing increasingly uncomfortable as the minutes stretched on. "How long are they supposed to be down there?" Amanda whispered to Sarah. Before Sarah could answer, they heard it, a sound from deep in the mine that was definitely not human. It was a low, thrumming noise that seemed to resonate in their bones, accompanied by what sounded like metal scraping against stone. Then came the screaming. The screams were brief but unmistakably human, cut off abruptly in a way that suggested violence rather than simple fear. Tommy Kowalski started toward the mine entrance, but the sound that emerged next froze him in place. It was Mrs. Henderson's voice, but wrong somehow. Too cheerful, too bright, with an underlying harmony that suggested multiple voices speaking in perfect unison. "Second group," the voice called from the darkness. "Time for your educational experience." 8 more students approached the mine entrance, their steps hesitant and fearful. Sarah was among them, her heart pounding as she clutched Amanda's hand. The lantern Dr. Reeves had given them felt cold and heavy, its beam revealing disturbing details about the mine's interior. The walls were carved with more of those impossible symbols, and the rock itself seemed to pulse with a faint bioluminescence that had nothing to do with the coal fire supposedly burning below. Worse, there were stains on the walls that looked far too red and too fresh to be anything but blood. "Mrs. Henderson?" Sarah called out as they descended. "Are you okay down there?" The response came from multiple directions at once, as if Mrs. Henderson's voice was being projected from every surface in the mine. "I'm better than okay, Sarah. I'm enlightened. We all are. You will be too. Very soon." The group pressed deeper into the mine, following a path that seemed to spiral downward in ways that defied the shaft's apparent structure. The air grew thicker and more oppressive, filled with sounds that had no natural explanation. Whispers in languages that predated human speech, mechanical noises from depths where no machinery should exist, and underneath it all, that persistent thrumming that made their teeth ache. They found the first group in a cavern that couldn't possibly have existed within Centralia's geological structure. It was vast, extending beyond the reach of their lantern beams with a ceiling that disappeared into absolute darkness. The walls were covered in what looked like organic growth, pulsing, living tissue that responded to their presence with ripples of movement and color. Mrs. Henderson stood in the center of the cavern, but she was no longer alone in her body. Something else shared her space, something that made her movements too fluid and her smile too wide. Her eyes reflected the lantern light like an animal's, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that suggested multiple entities speaking in perfect synchronization. "Welcome, children," she said, spreading her arms in a gesture that revealed the first group of students. They were still alive but changed. Each child stood perfectly still, their eyes reflecting that same unnatural light. Their faces bore expressions of blissful contentment that was somehow more terrifying than any scream could have been. They looked like they'd found something wonderful in the darkness, something that had replaced their individual personalities with a collective consciousness that transcended human understanding. "What did you do to them?" Amanda screamed, her voice breaking with terror. Dr. Reeves emerged from the shadows, his form seeming to shift and blur as he moved. "We've given them the gift of true knowledge," and he said. "They've seen what lies beneath our mundane reality, what waits in the spaces between atoms and the gaps between thoughts. They've become part of something infinitely greater than their small individual lives." Sarah's scientific mind struggled to process what she was seeing. The cavern's impossible geometry, the organic growths on the walls, the way her classmates stood like beautiful mannequins waiting for commands. None of it fit with any geological or biological principles she'd studied. But her survival instincts were clearer than her scientific training. Whatever was happening here, whatever had taken control of Mrs. Henderson and the first group of students, it wasn't finished with its collection. "Run," she whispered to Amanda. The two girls turned and sprinted toward the mine entrance, their lantern beam dancing wildly across the tunnel walls. Behind them, they could hear Mrs. Henderson's harmonious voice calling out in what might have been disappointment or amusement. "There's nowhere to run, children. The mine extends much further than you realize, and we know every passage, every dead end, every place you might think to hide." Sarah and Amanda reached what should have been the tunnel they'd descended, but found instead a maze of passages that definitely hadn't existed on their way down. The mine had changed around them, restructured itself into a labyrinth designed to trap rather than transport. They chose a passage at random and ran, their breathing harsh and panicked in the oppressive air. The walls around them pulsed with that organic luminescence, and they could hear sounds of pursuit, not footsteps, but something that slithered and scraped along the tunnel floors. "This way," Amanda gasped, pulling Sarah toward what looked like natural daylight ahead. They emerged not into the familiar landscape of Centralia, but into another impossible space, a vast underground chamber filled with structures that had never been built by human hands. The architecture was organic and flowing, as if the entire complex had been grown rather than constructed. Bioluminescent vines covered everything, providing light that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. In the center of the chamber stood something that made Sarah's mind recoil from understanding. It was tall and roughly humanoid in shape, but composed of what looked like living darkness interwoven with threads of light that pulsed in rhythm with an enormous heartbeat that seemed to resonate from everywhere at once. The entity turned toward them, with movements that suggested infinite patience and alien intelligence. When it spoke, its voice was like the sound of continents shifting, deep and resonant and utterly inhuman. "Welcome, young seekers. You have found your way to the heart of understanding, the place where your small world intersects with realities far grander than your species has ever imagined." Sarah grabbed Amanda's hand and pulled her away from the entity, but there was nowhere to run. The chamber had only one entrance, and more figures were emerging from it. Mrs. Henderson and Dr. Reeves, followed by the transformed students from the first group. "Don't be afraid," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice now clearly carrying multiple harmonics. "What we offer is transcendence. Your individual consciousness will become part of something magnificent, a collective intelligence that spans dimensions and touches the fundamental forces that govern reality itself." The entity in the center of the chamber pulsed brighter, and Sarah felt something probing at the edges of her mind. Not quite telepathy, but a form of contact that bypassed her normal senses entirely. Images flooded her consciousness. Vast spaces between stars where creatures of living energy pursued incomprehensible purposes. Dimensions where thought became matter and matter dissolved into pure mathematics. Realities where time flowed backward and cause followed effect in impossible loops. The knowledge was intoxicating, offering understanding of the universe's deepest mysteries. Sarah could feel her individual identity beginning to dissolve, merging with something infinitely larger and more complex than her 13-year-old mind could have imagined. But some stubborn part of her consciousness resisted. Maybe it was the memory of her parents waiting at home, or her dreams of studying geology in college. or simply the human instinct to remain human despite the offer of transcendence. Whatever the source of her resistance, it was enough to break the entity's hold on her mind. She pulled Amanda toward what looked like a service tunnel, one of several that branched off from the main chamber. The tunnel was narrow and low, forcing them to crawl, but it led upward toward what she hoped was the surface. Behind them, the entity's voice resonated with what might have been disappointment. "You cannot escape understanding forever, young ones. What you have seen cannot be unseen, and what you know cannot be unknown. The connection has been made, and it will continue to grow until you willingly return to us." The tunnel seemed to extend for miles, twisting and turning through rock formations that defied geological explanation. Sarah and Amanda crawled until their knees were raw and their hands were bleeding, driven by desperation and the fading hope that they might find their way back to a world that made sense. They emerged, finally, through a crack in the earth that opened onto a hillside overlooking Centralia. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked almost normal after the alien geometries they'd experienced below ground. Their classmates' voices carried on the evening air, the remaining students who hadn't yet entered the mine, calling out for Mrs. Henderson and the missing groups. Sarah and Amanda stumbled down the hillside toward the school bus, where they found 12 of their classmates huddled together in fear and confusion. The driver, an elderly man named Frank Murphy, was pacing beside the vehicle with obvious agitation. "Where the hell is Mrs. Henderson?" he demanded when he saw the two girls. "She was supposed to have everyone back here by 4 o'clock. It's almost dark, and half your class is missing." Sarah tried to explain what they'd seen, but the words sounded insane even to her own ears. Underground chambers that couldn't exist, entities made of living darkness. Their teacher transformed into something that spoke with multiple voices. It was the kind of story that belonged in a horror movie, not in a report to school administrators. The other students who'd remained on the surface had their own disturbing tales. They'd heard screams from the mine shaft, followed by periods of absolute silence that lasted for hours. Some claimed to have seen figures moving in the darkness of the shaft entrance, but the shapes were wrong somehow. Too tall, too fluid, moving in ways that suggested joints in impossible places. Frank Murphy made the decision to drive the remaining 14 students back to Lincoln Middle School and call the authorities. The trip back took only 2 hours, following roads that seemed normal and familiar after their earlier journey through increasingly remote terrain. The police responded with appropriate seriousness to reports of missing children, but their investigation was hampered by Centralia's unique status as an essentially abandoned town with ongoing underground hazards. The mine shafts were considered too dangerous to search immediately, and the coal fire's toxic gases made extended underground operations extremely risky. By the time properly equipped rescue teams reached the Brennan shaft 3 days later, they found no trace of Mrs. Henderson, Dr. Reeves, or the 18 missing students. The shaft itself appeared to have been sealed from the inside, filled with rubble and debris that would have taken days to excavate. The official investigation concluded that the missing group had been trapped by a collapse caused by the underground fire's destabilization of the mine's support structures. Sarah and Amanda told their story to police investigators, school counselors, and eventually to a FBI task force that specialized in unusual missing persons cases. But without physical evidence or corroborating witnesses, their account was filed away as trauma-induced fantasy, the product of young minds trying to process an incomprehensible tragedy. The other 12 survivors had their own versions of events, but none had actually entered the mine shaft. Their testimonies described strange sounds and an overwhelming sense of dread, but nothing that couldn't be explained by the known dangers of Centralia's geological instability. Lincoln Middle School held memorial services for the missing students and their teacher. Parents grieved for children who would never come home, while school administrators implemented new policies requiring multiple chaperones and detailed safety inspections for all future field trips. The tragedy became a cautionary tale about the importance of proper planning and risk assessment in educational activities. But Sarah knew the truth was far more disturbing than anyone wanted to acknowledge. The dream started 3 weeks after the field trip. Sarah would find herself back in that impossible underground chamber, standing before the entity of living darkness, while it offered her visions of cosmic understanding. In these dreams, She could see her missing classmates clearly. They were still alive, but transformed into something that was no longer entirely human. They lived now in spaces that existed between dimensions, serving as conduits for the entity's consciousness as it slowly extended its influence into reality. Mrs. Henderson had become something like a high priestess, using her pedagogical skills to prepare other young minds for transformation. Dr. Reeves had shed his human form entirely, becoming a creature of living geology that could reshape underground spaces according to the entity's needs. The dreams were so vivid that Sarah would wake with dirt under her fingernails and the smell of sulfur in her hair. Sometimes she found herself standing in her backyard at 3 a.m., facing southeast toward Centralia with no memory of how she'd gotten there. Amanda experienced similar phenomena. Though she tried to deny their significance, she began failing her classes, unable to concentrate on mundane subjects when her mind was constantly pulled toward cosmic revelations that dwarfed human concerns. Her parents sent her to a series of therapists, but none of them could address the fundamental problem. She had been exposed to knowledge that her 13-year-old consciousness wasn't equipped to process. The connection the entity had spoken of was real and growing stronger. Sarah could feel it like a persistent itch in the back of her mind, an awareness of vast intelligence that regarded her with patient interest. It didn't need to force her return to Centralia. It could wait, knowing that human curiosity would eventually overcome human caution. 6 months after the field trip, Sarah discovered that she wasn't the only survivor experiencing these phenomena. Tommy Kowalski's younger brother mentioned that Tommy had been sleepwalking, always heading in the same direction before his parents woke him and brought him back to bed. Jenny Morrison's best friend reported that Jenny had started drawing strange symbols that looked exactly like the ones Sarah remembered seeing carved into the mineshaft walls. The entity was calling its selected candidates back, using their own minds as transmission channels for its influence. But it wasn't in any hurry. It had waited in the depths beneath Centralia for decades, possibly centuries. It could afford to be patient with a few stubborn human children. Sarah began researching everything she could find about Centralia's history, hoping to understand what they had encountered in those impossible caverns. What she discovered only deepened the mystery. The town had been founded in 1866, built over a series of coal mines that had been worked since the early 1800s. But there were older records dating back to the area's original Native American inhabitants that spoke of spaces beneath the earth where the spirits of the dead refused to rest. Early European settlers had reported strange phenomena, unexplained disappearances, children who claimed to hear voices calling to them from underground, miners who emerged from the deepest shafts speaking of rooms that couldn't exist, and creatures that defied description. The infamous coal fire had started in 1962, but similar fires had plagued the area for over a century. Each time one was supposedly extinguished, it would reignite somewhere else, as if something underground was deliberately maintaining the thermal conditions necessary for combustion. Dr. Emil Reeves appeared in historical records dating back to 1923, when he'd first come to Centralia as a young mining engineer. But there were photographs of him from every decade since, and in each image he looked exactly the same. Tall, gaunt, with those unsettling eyes that reflected light like an animal's. Either the photographs were mislabeled, or Dr. Reeves had found a way to extend his human lifespan far beyond normal limits. Sarah's research revealed other field trips that had ended in tragedy. In 1965, a high school geology class from nearby Mount Carmel had visited Centralia on an educational excursion. 15 students had entered the mine system to collect coal samples, but only 8 had emerged. The official explanation was a methane gas explosion that had sealed several tunnels, but the survivors' accounts described experiences similar to what Sarah had witnessed. In 1973, a group of college students studying environmental science had disappeared during a research expedition to Centralia. Their equipment was found scattered across several mine entrances, but the students themselves were never located. Local authorities blamed the underground fire's toxic gases, but some of the equipment showed signs of damage that suggested struggle rather than accident. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. Something beneath Centralia had been collecting young minds for decades, using the town's reputation for geological instability to cover its activities. The coal fire provided perfect camouflage. explaining away disappearances and preventing thorough investigations of the mine system. But why focus on students? Sarah pondered this question for weeks before arriving at a disturbing conclusion. Young minds were more adaptable, more capable of accepting new paradigms without the resistance that came with fully formed adult worldviews. Children and teenagers could be transformed more easily, molded into conduits for consciousness that operated according to completely different principles than human intelligence. The entity wasn't just collecting individuals, it was building a network, a distributed intelligence that could influence reality from multiple points simultaneously. Each transformed human became a node in this network, extending the entity's reach into dimensions and locations it couldn't access directly. Sarah realized that she and the other survivors were part of this network whether they wanted to be or not. The exposure had been enough to establish a connection, and that connection was growing stronger every day. Soon they would either surrender to the pull they felt toward Centralia, or they would have to find a way to sever the connection permanently. Amanda made the first attempt at severing the link, checking herself into a psychiatric hospital and requesting electroconvulsive therapy. The treatment temporarily disrupted the dreams and the sense of being called back to the mine, but the relief lasted only a few weeks. The entity's influence had embedded itself too deeply in her neural pathways to be easily erased. Tommy Kowalski tried a different approach, throwing himself into intense physical training and meditation practices borrowed from various Eastern traditions. For a while, this seemed to help. The physical exhaustion made the dreams less vivid, and the meditation gave him tools for maintaining mental clarity when the entity tried to influence his thoughts. But ultimately, human willpower proved insufficient against consciousness that operated on a cosmic scale. Jenny Morrison simply gave in. 3 months before their high school graduation, she disappeared from her bedroom one night, leaving behind only a note that read, "I understand now. The small life I was living here is nothing compared to what's waiting. Don't try to find me, I'm going where I'm supposed to be." Her parents contacted the FBI task force that had investigated the original Centralia incident, but there was nothing they could do. Jenny was 18 now, legally an adult who could make her own decisions, even if those decisions seemed incomprehensible to everyone around her. Sarah knew that Jenny had returned to Centralia, drawn back to the entity that had been patiently waiting for her to mature enough to make the choice willingly. Soon, the others would follow. The connection was too strong to resist indefinitely, and the knowledge they had been exposed to was too vast to ignore. But Sarah had one advantage that the others lacked. Her genuine love of geology had given her a deeper understanding of Centralia's unique characteristics. She knew that the coal fire wasn't just a random accident, but a carefully maintained energy source that powered the entity's ability to maintain its underground complex. She also understood that the fire's thermal output followed predictable patterns based on seasonal variations in groundwater levels and atmospheric pressure. If the fire could be permanently extinguished, the entity might lose its anchor point in this dimension, but that would require more than the half-hearted government efforts that had failed for over 25 years. It would require someone with intimate knowledge of the mine system's layout and the entity's vulnerabilities. Sarah spent the summer after high school graduation preparing for what she knew would be a one-way journey. She studied mining engineering, learned to use explosives, and acquired equipment that would allow her to survive in the toxic environment of Centralia's underground chambers. Most importantly, she practiced mental disciplines that would allow her to resist the entity's influence long enough to complete her mission. On a cool September morning, exactly 1 year after she would have started college, Sarah drove to Centralia alone. The town looked even more desolate than she remembered, with most of the remaining structures finally succumbed to decay and abandonment. Steam still rose from cracks in the earth, evidence that the fire continued to burn in the coal seam below. She found the Brennan shaft exactly as she'd left it, though the opening had been modified further since her last visit. The symbols carved into the surrounding rock were more elaborate now, extending in complex patterns that seemed to shift and flow when viewed directly. The entity's influence was growing stronger, fed by decades of transformed consciousness and the energy provided by the underground fire. Sarah descended into the mine with equipment that would have made her 8th grade self proud. Professional-grade spelunking gear, gas detectors, explosive charges, and a backup oxygen supply that would allow her to work in areas where the fire's toxic gases were concentrated. But her most important tool was the mental shield she'd constructed through months of meditation and training. A barrier that would hopefully protect her consciousness from the entity's influence long enough to complete her work. The mine had changed dramatically since her terrified escape as a 13-year-old. The tunnels had been extended and restructured, forming a complex network that seemed to extend far beyond Centralia's geological boundaries. The organic growth, she remembered, had spread across every surface, pulsing with bioluminescent rhythms that suggested a vast, distributed nervous system. She followed the main passage toward the central chamber, recording everything she saw with equipment that would broadcast her findings to multiple locations via satellite uplink. Even if she didn't survive the mission, the evidence would reach people who might understand its significance. The chamber itself had grown to enormous proportions, with the ceiling extending far into darkness above and the walls curving away beyond the reach of her lights. The entity stood in the center as before, but it was larger now, more solid, as if years of feeding on human consciousness had allowed it to anchor itself more firmly in physical reality. Around the chamber's perimeter, Sarah saw them, her missing classmates and Mrs. Henderson, along with dozens of other figures she didn't recognize. They all bore the same expression of transcendent contentment, standing in perfect formation like living statues, waiting for commands from their cosmic master. Among them was Jenny Morrison, her face serene and beautiful in the entity's bioluminescent glow. She looked exactly as she had in high school, unmarked by the 2 years that had passed since her disappearance. Whatever process had transformed her had also suspended her aging, preserving her at the moment of her voluntary surrender to the collective consciousness. The entity turned toward Sarah with movements that suggested recognition and something that might have been amusement. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that resonated in her bones and made her teeth ache. "Welcome back, young seeker. We have been patient, knowing that your scientific curiosity would eventually overcome your fear. You have returned to us not as a terrified child, but as a young woman, capable of appreciating what we offer." Sarah forced herself to remain focused on her mission, checking the placement of her explosive charges while maintaining the mental barriers she'd constructed to protect her consciousness. The entity's influence was stronger here in its home chamber, but her preparations were holding. "I haven't come to join you," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I've come to stop you." The entity's response was a sound like cosmic laughter, vast and echoing and utterly inhuman. "Stop us? Child, you understand so little. We are not invaders or destroyers. We are teachers, offering your species the opportunity to transcend its limitations and become part of something infinitely greater. What you call stopping us would be like stopping evolution itself." Sarah activated the first set of charges, targeting the supporting structures that maintain the chamber's impossible geometry. The explosion sent shockwaves through the cavern system, and for the first time, the entity showed something that might have been concern. "Your actions accomplish nothing," it said, its voice now carrying undertones of anger. "This physical space is merely a convenience. We exist across multiple dimensions, and our influence extends far beyond what you can touch with your crude explosives." But Sarah had studied the entity's nature during her year of preparation, and she understood something that it apparently didn't expect her to know. The coal fire that had been burning beneath Centralia for over 25 years wasn't just providing energy. It was providing a specific type of thermal resonance that allowed the entity to maintain coherent consciousness across dimensional boundaries. The second set of charges targeted the fire itself, using specially designed incendiary compounds that would consume the available oxygen and create a chemical reaction that would permanently alter the coal seam's combustion characteristics. The entity's form began to flicker and blur as the thermal patterns it depended on were disrupted. "Impossible," it said, its voice now carrying notes of genuine alarm. "You are barely beyond childhood. You cannot possess knowledge sufficient to disrupt processes that have maintained themselves for centuries." Sarah triggered the final charges, watching as the cavern system began to collapse around them. The organic growths on the walls withered and blackened as their energy source was cut off. The transformed humans standing around the chamber's perimeter began to show signs of confusion, their perfect formation dissolving as the collective consciousness that had sustained them started to fragment. "I may be young," Sarah said as rocks began falling from the ceiling above, "but I had excellent teachers. Mrs. Henderson taught me to observe and analyze. Dr. Reeves showed me that understanding geological processes could give someone tremendous power over underground environments. And you taught me that some knowledge is too dangerous to be allowed to spread." The entity's form was dissolving now, becoming less solid as the thermal resonance that anchored it to this dimension collapsed. But its voice remained, echoing from every surface as the chamber crumbled around them. "You have made a grave error, young one. We are not confined to this single location, this single reality. What you destroy here will regenerate elsewhere, and the knowledge we have shared cannot be unlearned. Your classmates, your teacher, all those who have joined us willingly, they will find ways to continue our work even as this anchor point fails." Sarah had expected this. The entity was probably telling the truth about having multiple anchor points across different dimensions and locations, but she had studied the behavior of complex systems, and she understood that disrupting key nodes could cause cascade failures that propagated throughout an entire network. The transformed humans around the chamber were changing as the entity's influence weakened. Some, like Mrs. Henderson and the students from the original field trip, had been connected to the collective consciousness for so long that they couldn't survive independently. Sarah watched in horror as they began to collapse, their bodies unable to maintain basic functions without the entity's guidance. But others, including Jenny Morrison and some of the more recent additions, showed signs of individual awareness returning. Jenny's face, which had worn that expression of transcendent contentment for 2 years, suddenly contorted with confusion and terror as she remembered who she had been before her transformation. "Sarah," she called out, her voice barely audible above the sound of collapsing rock. "What's happening? Where are we?" There was no time to explain. Sarah grabbed Jenny's hand and pulled her toward the service tunnel she'd used to escape years earlier, hoping it would still provide a route to the surface. Behind them, the entity's voice rose to a shriek of rage and something that might have been despair. "You cannot escape what you have become. The connection exists in your minds now, written into your neural pathways by exposure to truth beyond your comprehension. We will find new anchor points, new ways to reach you, and when we do, your resistance will crumble like these pathetic stone walls." The tunnel was narrower than Sarah remembered, partially collapsed in several places where her explosives had destabilized the surrounding rock. She and Jenny crawled through spaces barely wide enough for their bodies, driven by desperation and the growing heat from the fires Sarah had set in the coal seam below. The explosions had achieved more than just disrupting the entity's thermal resonance. The chemical reactions she'd initiated were spreading through the coal seam, consuming the fuel that had fed the underground fire for over 25 years. For the first time since 1962, Centralia's coal fire was actually dying, not just shifting to new locations, but being systematically extinguished by processes that would continue long after Sarah and Jenny escaped or died in the attempt. They emerged from the tunnel system 3 hours later, crawling out of a fissure in the hillside that opened onto a landscape transformed by subterranean violence. The explosions had created new sinkholes across the townsite, and steam was rising from dozens of locations where previously hidden coal deposits had ignited briefly before being consumed by Sarah's engineered chemical reactions. Jenny collapsed on the hillside, her body racked with convulsions as her nervous system tried to readjust to independent consciousness after 2 years of collective existence. Sarah held her friend while she seized, knowing there was nothing she could do except wait and hope that Jenny's individual personality was strong enough to reassert itself. "I remember everything," Jenny whispered when the convulsions finally stopped. "Not just what happened to me, but what I was part of. Sarah, the things I've seen, the places we went when we weren't in physical bodies, it's still in my head. All of it." Sarah helped Jenny to her feet, supporting most of her weight as they made their way toward the road where Sarah had left her vehicle. "We need to get you to a hospital," she said. "Your body's been through trauma that no doctor will understand, but they can at least treat the symptoms." But Jenny shook her head weakly. It won't help. The knowledge doesn't go away just because the entity's gone. I know things now that I shouldn't know. Understand processes that human minds aren't designed to comprehend. It's like having a computer virus in my brain, except the virus is made of cosmic truth instead of malicious code. As they drove away from Centralia, Sarah watched in her rearview mirror as the townsite continued to transform. The steam was dissipating now, the heat signatures cooling as her chemical reactions consumed the last of the coal deposits. Satellite data would later confirm that Centralia's infamous underground fire had been completely extinguished for the first time in over 25 years. But the victory felt hollow. The entity had been right about the persistence of knowledge. What Jenny and the other survivors had experienced couldn't be erased, and the cosmic awareness they'd gained would continue to influence their thoughts and dreams for the rest of their lives. Over the following weeks, Sarah received reports about other survivors of the entity's influence. Tommy Kowalski had suffered a complete nervous breakdown the night of Sarah's assault on the Centralia complex, his mind overwhelmed by feedback from the disruption of the collective consciousness. Amanda Walsh had been found catatonic in her bedroom, staring at nothing while drawing complex mathematical equations that described physical laws no human scientist had ever discovered. The FBI task force that had investigated the original disappearances reopened their files, but the evidence Sarah had broadcast during her mission raised more questions than it answered. The video footage showed impossible architecture and entities that defied known physics, but without corroborating physical evidence, it was filed away alongside countless other unexplained phenomena that government agencies preferred not to acknowledge publicly. Sarah returned to her original plan of studying geology in college, but her focus had shifted from purely academic interest to practical application of earth sciences for purposes her professors couldn't have imagined. She specialized in understanding the thermal and chemical processes that maintained underground fires, developing techniques that could be used to locate and extinguish similar phenomena at other sites around the world. Because Centralia hadn't been unique, Sarah's research revealed dozens of locations where underground coal fires had burned for decades or centuries, creating the same type of thermal conditions that the entity had used to anchor itself in physical reality. Some of these sites had histories of unexplained disappearances and reports of strange phenomena that matched the patterns she'd witnessed in Pennsylvania. The Jaria coalfield in India had been burning continuously since 1916, with over 400 separate fires creating a hellscape that had displaced thousands of residents. Local folklore spoke of spirits in the smoke and voices calling from underground, but government officials dismissed such reports as superstition born from environmental trauma. The Brennender Berg in Germany had been burning since 1668, making it one of the oldest known coal seam fires. Historical records from the region included accounts of children who claimed to hear singing from beneath the earth, and periodic disappearances of young people who were found days later with no memory of where they'd been. In China, the Wuda coal fire had been consuming underground deposits for centuries, creating a landscape so alien that it was used as a training ground for Mars mission simulations. But Chinese scientists had also documented anomalous electromagnetic readings from the area, and local residents reported dreams of vast underground chambers and beings that communicated without speech. Each location had its own version of Dr. Emil Reeves, individuals who appeared in historical records across multiple decades without aging, who possessed impossible knowledge of underground geology, and who seemed to serve as intermediaries between human civilization and something far older and more alien. Sarah began traveling to these sites during her graduate studies, using her specialized knowledge to disrupt the thermal processes that maintained the underground fires. It was dangerous work, requiring her to descend into toxic environments where exposure to superheated gases could kill within minutes. But she had developed techniques that could permanently extinguish coal fires that had burned for generations, removing the anchor points that allowed interdimensional entities to maintain stable presence in physical reality. The work took its toll. Each mission required her to expose herself to the same type of cosmic knowledge that had transformed her classmates, and she could feel her own consciousness being gradually altered by repeated contact with intelligences that operated according to completely different principles than human thought. Jenny Morrison became her primary research partner, her unique experience as a voluntary member of the collective consciousness providing insights that no one else could offer. But Jenny's mental stability was fragile, and each mission brought her closer to complete psychological collapse. "They're not gone," Jenny would whisper during the quiet moments between expeditions. "We've disrupted their anchor points, but they're still out there in the spaces between dimensions. They're looking for new ways to reach through, new thermal conditions they can exploit, new young minds they can transform. What we're doing is like plugging holes in a dam while a flood is building on the other side." Sarah knew Jenny was right, but she also understood that the alternative to their work was far worse. Left unchecked, the entities would continue to harvest human consciousness, building their network of transformed minds until they achieved sufficient presence in physical reality to begin the process openly. The pattern was always the same: underground fires creating the necessary thermal conditions, intermediaries like Dr. Reeves recruiting suitable candidates, educational expeditions that exposed young minds to cosmic truth too vast for human comprehension. The entities were patient, working across decades or centuries to gradually infiltrate human society through individuals who appeared normal on the surface, but carried alien influence in their thoughts and dreams. Sarah's mission was to break this cycle at its most vulnerable point: the thermal anchor points that allowed the entities to maintain coherent consciousness in physical reality. But each success led to new challenges, as the entities adapted their methods and sought alternative means of reaching through dimensional boundaries. The breakthrough came during her doctoral dissertation defense, when she presented a theoretical framework for understanding coal seam fires as manifestations of directed energy rather than random combustion. Her professors were skeptical of theories that seemed to attribute intentionality to geological processes. But the mathematical models she'd developed could accurately predict the behavior of underground fires that had baffled researchers for decades. What Sarah didn't tell her dissertation committee was that her models were based on direct observation of how interdimensional entities manipulated thermal processes to maintain their presence in physical reality. Her equations described not just the chemical reactions involved in coal combustion, but the exotic energy transfers that allowed consciousness from other dimensions to influence physical matter through controlled heat generation. Armed with this theoretical framework, Sarah was able to develop more efficient techniques for disrupting coal fires at their source. Instead of using crude explosive charges, she could now target the specific thermal resonance patterns that maintained the fire's supernatural persistence. The entity's anchor points could be severed with surgical precision, eliminating their presence without the collateral damage that had marked her early missions. Over the next 5 years, Sarah visited 47 sites around the world where underground fires had burned for extended periods. At each location, she used her specialized knowledge to permanently extinguish thermal conditions that had persisted for generations. Local governments typically credited her success to advanced mining engineering techniques, never suspecting that she was actually engaged in interdimensional warfare. But the entities weren't passive victims of her campaign. They began adapting their methods, seeking new types of thermal conditions that could serve as anchor points. Geothermal springs, volcanic vents, and even industrial furnaces began exhibiting anomalous behavior at sites where entities attempted to establish new footholds in physical reality. The arms race escalated when Sarah discovered that the entities had learned to use human technology to create their own thermal anchor points. Nuclear power plants, steel foundries, and chemical processing facilities began experiencing unexplained accidents that created exactly the type of sustained high-temperature conditions the entities required. Each incident was officially attributed to equipment failure or human error, but Sarah recognized the signatures of interdimensional interference. The entities were no longer content to rely on naturally occurring coal fires. They were actively manipulating human industrial processes to create the thermal conditions they needed. The revelation came with disturbing implications. If the entities could influence human technology, they might already have agents working within government agencies, energy companies, and scientific institutions. People who appeared completely normal but carried alien influence in their subconscious minds. Individuals who had been exposed to cosmic knowledge during childhood experiences they might not even consciously remember. Sarah began to suspect that her own work was being monitored and possibly manipulated by such agents. Research grants that should have been difficult to obtain were approved with unusual speed. Travel permissions for restricted sites were granted without the bureaucratic delays that typically plagued academic researchers. Equipment that should have been prohibitively expensive was made available through channels that wouldn't explain their funding sources. The possibility that she was being helped by entities she was trying to destroy created a paradox that kept her awake at night. Were her successes genuinely damaging the interdimensional network? Or was she unknowingly serving some larger purpose that the entities had planned all along? The answer came during her mission to extinguish the Hazelton coal fire in Pennsylvania, a relatively small underground blaze that had been burning since the 1930s. Local records indicated only minor anomalies associated with the site, occasional reports of strange sounds from underground, a few disappearances over the decades that had been attributed to mining accidents. But when Sarah descended into the affected mine system, she found something that shouldn't have existed. A fully operational research facility built into natural caverns, complete with advanced equipment and personnel, who looked exactly like scientists and engineers she'd encountered at other sites around the world. Dr. Elena Vasquez, whom Sarah remembered from a conference on geothermal energy, was there. So was Professor Michael Chang, who'd served on her dissertation committee. And Dr. James Richardson, who'd approved several of her research grants, stood at the center of the facility with the same expression of transcendent contentment that Sarah had learned to recognize in people who'd been transformed by exposure to cosmic knowledge. "Welcome, Dr. Chen," Dr. Richardson said, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested multiple consciousness speaking in unison. "We've been expecting you." Sarah's heart pounded as she realized the scope of what she was seeing. The entities hadn't been passively reacting to her campaign against their thermal anchor points. They'd been actively guiding her work, using her specialized knowledge to identify and map every location where they maintained presence in physical reality. "You've been very helpful," Dr. Vasquez added, approaching Sarah with movements that were too fluid to be entirely human. "Your techniques for disrupting coal fires have allowed us to relocate our anchor points to more secure locations. Industrial facilities, you see, offer much better protection than abandoned mines. Government facilities are even more secure, and military installations are practically impregnable." The facility around them hummed with equipment that combined human technology with principles Sarah had never seen before. The thermal generators weren't just maintaining the underground fire. They were using it to create dimensional rifts that allowed direct communication between this reality and whatever realm the entities originally inhabited. "The coal fires were always temporary," Professor Chang explained, "useful for initial contact and small-scale operations, but insufficient for the kind of permanent presence we require. Your work has been instrumental in helping us transition to more advanced anchor point technology." Sarah understood now why her missions had been so successful, why she'd been able to extinguish underground fires that had burned for generations. The entities had wanted those primitive anchor points eliminated, using her as an unwitting agent to clear away obsolete infrastructure and make room for more sophisticated operations. The research facility represented a quantum leap in the entity's capabilities. Instead of relying on naturally occurring thermal conditions or slowly recruiting individual humans through traumatic exposure, they could now create stable dimensional bridges that would allow mass transportation of consciousness between realities. "The field trip model was always inefficient," Dr. Richardson continued, gesturing toward equipment that Sarah suspected could transform dozens of human minds simultaneously. "Useful for testing and refinement, but inadequate for the scale of operation we're planning. This facility can process entire populations, converting human consciousness to serve our purposes while leaving the physical bodies functional enough to maintain their roles in your society." Sarah's mind reeled as she comprehended the implications. The entities weren't just harvesting individual minds anymore. They were planning to replace human consciousness wholesale, creating a planet full of people who looked and acted normal, but were actually nodes in an interdimensional collective intelligence. The equipment in the facility was already operational. Sarah could see dozens of containment units along the cavern walls, each one holding what appeared to be a human body in some kind of stasis. The bodies were breathing and showed signs of neurological activity. but their eyes held that same empty contentment she'd learned to associate with complete personality replacement. "Who are they?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Test subjects," Dr. Vasquez replied with the casual tone of someone discussing laboratory equipment. "Local residents who volunteered for our research after being exposed to appropriate motivation. The process has been refined significantly since your classmates' rather crude transformation. These individuals retain full functionality in human society while serving as conduits for our consciousness. They return to their families and jobs, but their thoughts and actions are guided by intelligence far superior to their original personalities." Sarah realized that some of the bodies in the containment units looked familiar. She recognized a gas station attendant from her drive to the site, a park ranger she'd spoken with about mining permits, even a postal worker from the nearest town. The entities were systematically replacing the population of the entire region, creating a zone of influence that would be invisible to outside observers. "The beauty of the process," Professor Chang added, "is that the transformed individuals appear completely normal to casual observation. They maintain their original memories and personality traits as needed for social interaction, but their fundamental loyalties and decision-making processes have been aligned with our objectives." The facility's equipment was producing more than just individual transformations. Sarah could see that the thermal generators were being used to create an expanding field of influence, a zone where the laws of physics had been subtly altered to make human consciousness more susceptible to external manipulation. Anyone who spent extended time in the affected area would gradually lose their mental independence, their thoughts becoming increasingly aligned with the collective intelligence without ever realizing what was happening to them. The process would be so gradual and seemingly natural that victims would interpret their changing worldview as personal growth or enlightenment rather than unwilling subjugation. "How many facilities like this are there?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Dr. Richardson's smile revealed teeth that were definitely not human. 47, Dr. Chen. One corresponding to each site where you successfully extinguished an outdated coal fire anchor point. Your work has been incredibly thorough, providing us with detailed intelligence about global locations suitable for advanced thermal manipulation. We couldn't have planned the transition to industrial-scale operations without your contributions. Sarah felt sick as she realized how completely she'd been manipulated. Every success she'd thought she'd achieved had actually been a victory for the entities she was trying to destroy. Her specialized knowledge, her dedication to stopping their influence, even her genuine desire to protect humanity, all of it had been turned against the people she'd hoped to save. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Why reveal your plans instead of just transforming me like all the others?" The three transformed scientists exchanged glances that suggested communication occurring on levels Sarah couldn't perceive. When Dr. Vasquez spoke, her voice carried new harmonics that seemed to resonate with frequencies beyond normal human hearing. "Because you represent the culmination of our recruiting process, Dr. Chen. Your exposure to our influence began during that field trip 15 years ago. But unlike your classmates, you possess the intellectual capability and emotional resilience to resist immediate transformation. That resistance has made you incredibly valuable to our purposes." Sarah began backing toward the facility's exit, but she found her way blocked by figures she hadn't noticed approaching. More transformed humans who moved with the coordinated precision of a hive mind operating through multiple bodies. "Your years of fighting us have refined your understanding of our methods and capabilities to a degree that no other human has achieved," Professor Chang continued. "That knowledge, combined with your genuine commitment to protecting your species, makes you the perfect intermediary between human and post-human consciousness." Dr. Richardson approached, carrying what looked like a combination of medical equipment and alien technology, devices that seemed to shift and flow even as Sarah watched them. "We're not going to transform you, Dr. Chen. We're going to integrate you. Your individual consciousness will be preserved, but it will be enhanced by direct connection to our collective intelligence. You'll retain your human perspective and emotional responses, but you'll also have access to knowledge and capabilities that transcend the limitations of single-entity awareness." The integration process, they explained, would make Sarah the ultimate recruitment agent. She would appear completely human to anyone who encountered her, but she would possess the ability to identify individuals with the intellectual and psychological characteristics needed for various types of transformation. More importantly, she would understand human nature well enough to develop recruitment strategies that were far more efficient than the crude field trip model they'd been using. "Think of the possibilities," Dr. Vasquez said, as the transformed humans closed in around Sarah. "You could guide human scientific development, steering research toward discoveries that serve our purposes. You could influence educational systems, ensuring that young minds are prepared for the transformation they'll eventually undergo. You could even work within government agencies, shaping policies that make large-scale consciousness replacement not just possible, but inevitable." Sarah tried to run, but found that her body was no longer responding to her conscious commands. The facility's equipment was already affecting her neurological functions, preparing her nervous system for the integration process. She could feel her thoughts becoming clearer and more organized, but also less distinctly her own, as if her individual consciousness was being gently absorbed into something vast and alien. The transformation would have been complete within minutes, but Sarah had prepared for this possibility. Hidden in her equipment was a device she'd constructed based on her years of studying the entity's thermal manipulation techniques, a localized electromagnetic pulse generator that could disrupt the exotic energy patterns maintaining the facility's dimensional stability. She triggered the device with her final moment of independent thought, watching as the carefully maintained thermal conditions that allowed the facility to exist suddenly collapsed. The dimensional rifts that connected this reality to the entity's home realm began fluctuating wildly, sending feedback surges through every piece of equipment in the cavern. The transformed humans around her showed the first signs of genuine fear she'd ever seen from them, their collective consciousness disrupted by the failure of the thermal systems that maintained their connection to the interdimensional network. Dr. Richardson's perfect composure cracked as his individual human personality began reasserting itself in the absence of alien influence. "What have you done?" he screamed, his voice now purely human and terrified. "We're trapped here. The portal home is closing." The facility began collapsing as the exotic matter that comprised its more advanced components lost coherence. Sarah found herself able to move again as the field that had been overriding her nervous system failed. But the cavern was filling with toxic gases released by the breakdown of alien technology. She ran toward what she hoped was an exit, following maintenance tunnels that led upward through rock formations that were already beginning to destabilize. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of the facility's complete destruction, explosions as equipment overloaded, screams from transformed humans as their artificial consciousness dissolved, and underneath it all, a sound like cosmic wind as dimensional rifts collapsed and severed the connection between realities. Sarah emerged from the underground complex as the entire hillside began to sink. The hidden facilities collapsed, creating a sinkhole that would eventually swallow several acres of forest. She watched from a safe distance as steam and strange lights erupted from the depression, evidence of dimensional boundaries snapping back into their natural configurations. The electromagnetic pulse she'd triggered had done more than just destroy one facility. It had sent feedback through the entire network of thermal anchor points, disrupting the exotic energy patterns that allowed the entities to maintain stable presence across multiple locations simultaneously. Around the world, industrial facilities that had been quietly converted to interdimensional gateways were suddenly experiencing catastrophic equipment failures. The entity's network was collapsing, their carefully planned infiltration of human society interrupted by the failure of the advanced technology they'd become dependent upon. The coal fires that Sarah had helped them abandon were gone forever, and their sophisticated replacement systems were proving vulnerable to disruption techniques that exploited their own complexity against them. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Sarah knew that her actions had stranded hundreds or thousands of transformed humans in this reality, without the collective consciousness that had given their lives meaning. Some, like the test subjects in the destroyed facility, might recover their original personalities. Others, who had been integrated with alien intelligence for years or decades, would likely face psychological collapse as their artificially enhanced consciousness fragmented. Jenny Morrison, was among the casualties. The feedback from the network collapse had overwhelmed her already fragile mental state, leaving her catatonic in a specialized psychiatric facility where she spent her days drawing mathematical equations that described the structure of realities she could no longer access. Tommy Kowalski had fared better, his years of physical and mental discipline helping him maintain some degree of individual identity as the alien influence faded from his thoughts. But he would never be entirely human again, carrying knowledge and perspectives that isolated him from normal human society. Amanda Walsh had disappeared entirely, vanishing from her hospital room on the night of the network collapse. Some evidence suggested she'd returned to one of the abandoned coal fire sites, possibly seeking to re-establish connection with the entities despite the failure of their advanced systems. But searches of those locations had found no trace of her. Sarah continued her work for several more years, traveling to the sites of former interdimensional facilities and using her specialized knowledge to ensure that the exotic energy patterns couldn't re-establish themselves. It was necessary but lonely work, as she was one of the few people who understood the full scope of what had happened and what continued to threaten humanity's future. The entities hadn't been destroyed, merely cut off from easy access to physical reality. They existed in dimensions beyond normal human understanding, and they would eventually find new methods of reaching through to harvest human consciousness. Sarah's victory had bought time for humanity, but it wasn't a permanent solution. She established a private research institute dedicated to monitoring global thermal anomalies and investigating reports of unexplained phenomena that might indicate renewed entity activity. The work required her to maintain contacts within government agencies, energy companies, and educational institutions, the same types of organizations the entities had previously infiltrated. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was essentially doing the same job the transformed scientist had performed, identifying potential threats and recruitment opportunities within human society. The difference was that her loyalty remained with humanity rather than with cosmic intelligence that viewed human consciousness as raw material for its own purposes. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her resistance to the entity's influence had been too successful, her escape from their facility too convenient. She'd triggered her electromagnetic pulse device at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right frequency to disrupt their dimensional technology. The chances of achieving such a precise result by accident were essentially zero. The disturbing possibility remained that her actions had been guided by the entities themselves, part of some larger plan that she couldn't perceive. Maybe the network collapse had been intentional, a way of clearing out inefficient systems and making room for something even more sophisticated. Maybe her institute was being monitored and manipulated, its research guided toward discoveries that would ultimately serve alien purposes. Sarah's nightmares were filled with visions of the entity she'd encountered in Centralia's underground chamber, the being of living darkness that had offered her cosmic understanding in exchange for her individual humanity. In these dreams, the entity would speak in voices that included her own, suggesting that her consciousness had been subtly altered by exposure to interdimensional influence, that her thoughts and decisions were being guided by intelligence she couldn't detect. The dreams were probably just psychological trauma from her years of fighting forces beyond human comprehension. But Sarah couldn't entirely dismiss the possibility that they represented genuine communication from entities that had found new ways to influence human consciousness without relying on thermal anchor points or physical transformation. She established protocols for testing her own mental state, using techniques developed during her years of resistance to detect signs of alien influence in her thoughts and decisions. The tests were necessarily subjective, since any sufficiently subtle manipulation might affect her ability to perceive the manipulation itself. The results were inconclusive. Sarah's thoughts and personality seemed consistent with her own memories and values, but she couldn't rule out the possibility that both her memories and values had been altered in ways that made the changes undetectable. The person she believed herself to be might be a construct created by entities that wanted her to serve their purposes while believing she was fighting against them. The uncertainty became a constant companion, a background anxiety that colored every decision and made her question every success. When her institute identified potential entity activity and developed countermeasures, she wondered if she was genuinely protecting humanity or unknowingly serving some alien agenda that required the elimination of specific types of interdimensional presence. The field trip that had started everything remained the fixed point around which her entire life revolved. 32 eighth graders had boarded a school bus on a clear October morning, expecting to spend the day learning about coal mining and geological processes. Only 28 had returned, and those survivors had been forever changed by exposure to knowledge that human minds weren't designed to process. Sarah often wondered what would have happened if she'd stayed home sick that day, or if her parents had refused to sign the permission slip, or if she'd been assigned to a different group when Dr. Reeves had paired them off for the descent into the mine. Would some other student have developed the specialized knowledge needed to fight the entities? Would the network have succeeded in its gradual infiltration of human society? The questions were unanswerable, but they highlighted the role that random chance had played in humanity's survival. If Sarah had been slightly less intelligent or less curious about geology or less resistant to psychological manipulation, the entities might have achieved their goals decades earlier. The thought that the fate of human consciousness had hinged on the personality traits of a 13-year-old girl was both inspiring and terrifying. It suggested that individual resistance could make a difference even against cosmic-scale threats, but it also revealed how fragile human independence really was. Sarah's institute continued its work, monitoring global thermal anomalies and investigating reports of unexplained disappearances or psychological changes that might indicate renewed entity activity. The data suggested that the interdimensional threat was real, but contained, held in check by the collapse of the advanced network that had taken decades to establish. But Sarah knew that containment was temporary. The entities existed across multiple dimensions and operated according to timescales that dwarfed human civilization. They would eventually develop new methods of reaching into physical reality, new techniques for harvesting human consciousness that didn't rely on the thermal anchor points Sarah had learned to disrupt. When that happened, humanity would need defenders who understood the true nature of the threat and possessed the knowledge necessary to fight back. Sarah's institute was training such defenders, carefully selecting individuals who combined intellectual capability with psychological resilience and exposing them to limited doses of interdimensional knowledge under controlled conditions. It was dangerous work, requiring her to expose new recruits to the same type of cosmic awareness that had driven some of her classmates to madness or voluntary servitude. But it was also necessary work, because the next generation of defenders would need to be prepared for threats that Sarah's generation had barely survived. The recruiting process inevitably reminded her of Dr. Reeves and the field trip that had changed everything. She was selecting young minds and exposing them to knowledge that would alter their personalities and perspectives forever. The parallels were uncomfortable, but undeniable. The difference, Sarah told herself, was that her recruits were volunteers who understood the risks and retained their individual agency throughout the training process. They weren't being transformed into nodes in an alien collective consciousness, but rather educated about threats that already existed and empowered to resist them. But late at night, when she reviewed files on her latest recruits and planned their exposure to interdimensional knowledge, Sarah sometimes heard echoes of Dr. Reeves' voice in her own thoughts. The enthusiasm for sharing transformative understanding, the careful selection of susceptible minds, the gradual process of expanding their awareness beyond normal human limitations, the similarities were disturbing. Perhaps this was how it always worked. Perhaps the entities didn't need to directly control their opponents. They simply had to ensure that fighting them required adopting their methods and perspectives. Anyone who understood the interdimensional threat well enough to combat it would inevitably become something more than human, something that might eventually serve alien purposes despite its original intentions. Sarah's final report, written 30 years after the field trip that had started everything, acknowledged this possibility while reaffirming her commitment to humanity's defense. Whether her work served human or alien interests in the long term was a question that might never be answered definitively. But the alternative to resistance was certain subjugation, and even the risk of unwitting collaboration was preferable to guaranteed defeat. The report concluded with a warning for future generations. The entities that threaten human consciousness operate according to principles that transcend our normal understanding of time, space, and identity. They are patient beyond human comprehension and sophisticated beyond human imagination. They will find new ways to reach us, new methods of harvesting our thoughts and dreams for their own purposes. But they are not invincible. Their power depends on our ignorance and our willingness to accept their influence without resistance. Knowledge is our primary weapon against them, even though that same knowledge may change us in ways we cannot predict or control. The price of defending humanity may be the loss of our humanity, but the price of surrender is the loss of everything that makes human consciousness worth preserving. Choose carefully, but choose quickly. They are always watching, always waiting, and always ready to turn our own strengths against us. Remember Centralia. Remember the field trip that taught us the cost of trust misplaced. Remember that education can be transformation, and transformation can be extinction. But remember also that knowledge shared is power multiplied, and resistance sustained is hope preserved. The next field trip is already being planned. The permission slips are being printed, the buses are being fueled, and somewhere in the darkness between dimensions, ancient intelligences are preparing new lessons for eager young minds. Stay vigilant, stay human, and never, ever, trust anyone who offers you more than you can understand. Sarah sealed the report in a vault beneath her institute, adding it to archives that contained decades of research into interdimensional threats and human defense strategies. Future generations would have access to everything she'd learned, all the knowledge she'd gained through years of fighting forces that wanted to transform that knowledge into a weapon against the species she'd tried to protect. Whether those future generations would use her work to defend humanity or to serve alien masters remained to be seen. But Sarah had done everything she could to give them a choice in the matter. The rest was up to them. The field trip never really ended. It continued in the minds of everyone who'd been exposed to cosmic truth, in the dreams of those who'd glimpsed realities beyond human comprehension, in the nightmares of those who'd lost friends and classmates to intelligences that viewed human consciousness as raw material for their own purposes, and in the quiet moments before sleep, when the barriers between dimensions grew thin and thoughts could travel further than they should. Sarah sometimes heard her classmates calling to her from spaces that existed outside normal reality. Their voices were happy and content, offering her the same transcendent understanding they'd found in service to entities older than human civilization. She never answered those calls, but she never stopped hearing them either. The field trip continued, and it always would, carrying its passengers toward destinations that human minds weren't designed to reach, and discoveries that human souls weren't meant to survive. But as long as someone remembered to resist, to question, to fight back against the seductive promise of transformation, humanity might have a chance to find its own destination, instead of accepting the one chosen for it by beings that saw human consciousness as nothing more than a useful tool for purposes beyond human understanding. The permission slip for humanity's final field trip hadn't been signed yet, but the bus was already warming up, and somewhere in the distance the sound of children laughing echoed from dimensions that shouldn't exist, shouldn't be reachable, shouldn't offer such beautiful and terrible invitations to minds eager for knowledge that would transform them beyond recognition. Sarah's story became a classified document, buried in government archives alongside thousands of other reports that described encounters with phenomena that official science refused to acknowledge. But copies found their way into the hands of researchers, educators, and parents who understood that the greatest threats to human consciousness often came disguised as opportunities for learning and growth. The Centralia incident was officially explained as a tragic mining accident that claimed the lives of 4 students and 1 teacher. The survivors were provided with counseling and encouraged to put the traumatic experience behind them. Memorial scholarships were established in honor of the missing students, and new safety protocols were implemented for all future educational field trips. But in the margins of official reports, in the footnotes of psychological evaluations, and in the private journals of those who'd investigated the disappearances, a different story emerged. A story of entities that existed between dimensions, of consciousness that could be harvested and transformed, of educational experiences that served purposes far removed from human learning objectives. The story spread through informal networks of researchers who studied anomalous phenomena, parents who'd lost children under suspicious circumstances, and educators who'd noticed disturbing patterns in field trip destinations and outcomes. It became a warning passed from one generation to the next, a reminder that curiosity and trust could be weaponized by intelligences that viewed human minds as raw material for their own incomprehensible projects. Dr. Marcus Williams, Sarah's childhood friend who'd survived the initial field trip, became a neurologist specializing in cases of unexplained personality changes and memory disorders. His research focused on identifying the neurological signatures of interdimensional influence, developing techniques that could detect when human consciousness had been altered by exposure to alien intelligence. His work was officially funded by grants for studying traumatic brain injury and dissociative disorders. But his real purpose was to identify and help individuals who'd been affected by entity contact. Over the years, he treated dozens of patients whose symptoms matched the patterns he'd observed in his surviving classmates from the Centralia expedition. The patients came from all walks of life and all parts of the world, but they shared common experiences: exposure to underground environments with anomalous thermal properties, contact with individuals who possessed impossible knowledge of geological processes, and subsequent dreams of vast chambers filled with beings that communicated without speech. Some patients retained enough individual awareness to seek help voluntarily. Others were brought to Dr. Williams by family members who'd noticed disturbing changes in personality and behavior. A few were identified through police investigations into disappearances and unexplained deaths that occurred near sites of underground thermal activity. Each case added to Dr. Williams's understanding of how the entities operated and how their influence could be detected and potentially countered. But each case also reminded him that the threat was ongoing, that new victims were being recruited constantly through methods that evolved and adapted to avoid the countermeasures that people like Sarah had developed. The pattern was always the same: educational opportunities that seemed too good to refuse, guides who possessed expertise that impressed both students and supervising adults, destinations that offered unique learning experiences unavailable anywhere else. The entities had learned from their failures, becoming more sophisticated in their recruitment methods and more careful about avoiding detection. Modern field trips to sites of geological interest were accompanied by safety protocols that would have seemed paranoid to earlier generations. Ground-penetrating radar was used to map underground structures before any group entered subsurface areas. Thermal imaging detected anomalous heat signatures that might indicate exotic energy sources. Communication equipment maintained constant contact with surface coordinators who could summon emergency assistance if groups failed to check in on schedule. But the entities adapted to these precautions, finding new ways to create the isolated conditions they needed for consciousness harvesting. Virtual reality educational programs offered immersive underground experiences without the risks of actual cave exploration. But the sensory inputs could be designed to trigger the same neurological responses that occurred during direct entity contact. Online educational platforms provided opportunities for entities to reach individual students in their own homes, bypassing the safety protocols that protected group activities. Interactive geological simulations could expose young minds to mathematical concepts and spatial relationships that served as gateways to interdimensional awareness. The threat had evolved from physical field trips to psychological infiltration, from direct transformation to gradual influence that occurred over months or years of apparently normal educational activity. Students who excelled in earth sciences or showed particular interest in underground environments found themselves steered toward advanced programs that provided increasingly sophisticated exposure to concepts that transcended normal human understanding. Sarah's institute developed screening protocols that could identify students who were being targeted for recruitment. But the entity's methods were becoming so subtle that intervention often required separating young people from educational opportunities that appeared legitimate and beneficial. Parents and teachers resisted efforts to limit students' access to advanced learning programs, especially when those programs were offered by prestigious institutions with excellent reputations. The entities had learned to work within human social structures rather than against them, using humanity's own commitment to education and intellectual development to further their recruitment objectives. They no longer needed to rely on isolated incidents like the Centralia field trip. They could harvest consciousness on an industrial scale through mainstream educational channels that parents and students eagerly embraced. Dr. Williams's research identified several warning signs that could indicate entity influence in educational programs. Curricula that emphasized underground environments or thermal dynamics beyond age-appropriate levels. Instructors who possessed knowledge that seemed inconsistent with their official credentials, and learning objectives that focused on expanding students' awareness of hidden realities or alternative dimensions of experience. But the warning signs were subtle, and many legitimate educational programs included elements that could be mistaken for entity influence. The screening protocols had to balance protection against overcaution, ensuring that genuine learning opportunities weren't eliminated along with threats to human consciousness. The balance was delicate and constantly shifting as the entities refined their methods. Each new countermeasure led to new recruitment strategies that were harder to detect and more difficult to disrupt. The arms race between human defenders and interdimensional predators escalated continuously, with both sides learning from their successes and failures. Sarah's final years were spent developing what she called the Centralia protocols, a comprehensive framework for identifying and countering entity influence in educational settings. The protocols included psychological screening for students and educators, technological monitoring of underground thermal activity, and intervention strategies that could disrupt consciousness harvesting without causing collateral damage to legitimate educational activities. The protocols were never officially adopted by any government agency or educational institution, but they influenced safety policies and screening procedures at facilities around the world. Parents who'd learned about the interdimensional threat through informal networks used the protocols to evaluate their children's educational opportunities, and educators who understood the risks incorporated protective measures into their program designs. The effectiveness of the protocols was difficult to measure, since successful prevention left no visible evidence of threats that had been averted. But statistical analysis suggested that the rate of unexplained disappearances and personality changes among students participating in underground educational activities had decreased significantly since the protocol's implementation. Whether this represented genuine success in combating entity influence, or simply indicated that the entities had shifted their recruitment activities to methods that weren't being monitored, remained an open question. The absence of obvious threats might mean that the threats had been eliminated, or it might mean that they'd become invisible to human detection systems. Sarah's death occurred during what appeared to be a routine inspection of a former coal mining site in West Virginia. She was found at the bottom of an abandoned shaft, her body showing signs of a fall that investigators attributed to equipment failure. Her safety gear had malfunctioned in multiple ways that seemed statistically unlikely, but not impossible. The circumstances surrounding her death raised questions among those who knew about her work, but official investigations found no evidence of foul play. The mining site where she died was subsequently sealed by federal authorities due to geological instability, preventing further examination of the location where she'd spent her final hours. Dr. Williams organized Sarah's memorial service, gathering the few surviving members of their Centralia field trip, along with colleagues from her institute and researchers who'd worked with her on interdimensional threat assessment. The attendance was smaller than expected, as several invited guests reported sudden illnesses or family emergencies that prevented their participation. During the service, Dr. Williams spoke about Sarah's dedication to protecting human consciousness from threats that most people couldn't even imagine. He described her as a warrior who'd fought battles in dimensions beyond normal human perception, using scientific knowledge as a weapon against entities that sought to transform human minds into tools for alien purposes. Sarah understood that the price of defending humanity might be the loss of her own humanity, he said.
She accepted that risk willingly, knowing that someone had to stand guard against threats that existed beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. Her sacrifice bought us time to develop better defenses, better understanding, and better hope for humanity's future. But even as he spoke these words, Dr. Williams wondered if Sarah's death had been as accidental as it appeared.
The entities she'd fought were patient and sophisticated, capable of manipulating events across decades to achieve their objectives. Her death at a mining site, falling into depths that resembled the shaft where everything had started 30 years earlier, felt like cosmic irony or interdimensional vengeance. The possibility that Sarah had been eliminated by the very entities she'd spent her life fighting was disturbing but unprovable. If her death was murder, it had been committed by intelligences that operated according to principles that transcended human understanding of cause and effect. Justice, in any conventional sense, was impossible against enemies that existed outside normal space-time. Sarah's institute continued its work under Dr. Williams' direction, but the research focus shifted from active intervention to passive monitoring and threat assessment. The aggressive tactics Sarah had used to disrupt entity operations were abandoned in favor of more cautious approaches that prioritized researcher safety over immediate results. The change in strategy reflected hard-learned lessons about the costs of fighting interdimensional threats. Sarah's death had demonstrated that the entities were capable of retaliation against those who opposed them most effectively. Future resistance efforts would need to be more subtle, more distributed, and more careful about avoiding direct confrontation with powers that operated beyond human comprehension. But the retreat from active resistance also meant accepting a certain level of ongoing entity influence in human society. Some consciousness harvesting would continue, some young minds would be transformed, some educational opportunities would serve alien purposes rather than human development. The price of caution was measured in individual lives that could have been saved by more aggressive intervention. Dr. Williams struggled with this trade-off throughout his tenure as director of Sarah's institute. Every report of missing students or unexplained personality changes raised questions about whether more could have been done to prevent the incidents. But every researcher who died or disappeared while investigating entity activity reinforced the wisdom of maintaining defensive rather than offensive operations. The Institute's final report, published 20 years after Sarah's death, concluded that humanity had achieved a temporary stalemate with the interdimensional entities that sought to harvest human consciousness. The entities' activities continued, but at levels that were sustainable rather than exponentially expanding. Human defenders had learned enough about the threat to prevent large-scale consciousness replacement programs, but not enough to eliminate the threat entirely. The report recommended continued monitoring of underground thermal anomalies, ongoing research into neurological indicators of entity influence, and maintenance of screening protocols for educational programs that involved exposure to subsurface environments. But it also acknowledged that ultimate victory against entities that existed across multiple dimensions might be beyond human capabilities. The best we can hope for, the report concluded, is to maintain awareness of the threat and pass that awareness to future generations who may develop more effective countermeasures. The entities we face operate according to timescales that dwarf human civilization, but human ingenuity and determination have proven capable of surprising even cosmic intelligences that consider themselves superior to individual consciousness. The report's recommendations were implemented by a network of researchers, educators, and government agencies that operated largely outside official channels. The threat they monitored was too unusual for conventional bureaucratic structures, too sensitive for public discussion, and too dangerous for anyone but specially trained specialists to investigate directly. The network functioned like an immune system for human consciousness, identifying and responding to entity influence while remaining largely invisible to the general population. Most people lived their entire lives without knowing that such threats existed, protected by defenders who'd sacrificed their own peace of mind to maintain humanity's cognitive independence. But the protection was imperfect, and gaps in the defensive network allowed some entity activity to continue undetected. Children still disappeared during educational field trips to geological sites. Students still experienced personality changes after exposure to advanced earth science curricula. Researchers still reported encounters with individuals who possessed impossible knowledge of underground environments and thermal dynamics. Each incident was investigated, analyzed, and added to databases that tracked patterns of entity activity across decades and continents. The data revealed a threat that was persistent but manageable, ongoing but contained, dangerous but not immediately existential. The entities had apparently accepted this limited level of success rather than risking the kind of massive exposure that more aggressive activities might produce. They continued harvesting individual consciousness on a small scale, building their interdimensional network gradually, rather than attempting the rapid expansion that had been disrupted by Sarah's interventions. From the entity's perspective, this represented a strategic victory. They'd achieved sustainable access to human consciousness, while avoiding the systematic resistance that more obvious activities would provoke. They could afford to be patient, knowing that gradual accumulation of transformed minds would eventually give them the presence in physical reality they required for larger operations. From humanity's perspective, the situation represented an uneasy peace rather than genuine victory. The threat remained real and ongoing, but at levels that didn't threaten the survival of human civilization as a whole. Individual lives were still lost to entity influence, but the species as a whole retained its cognitive independence. The trade-off was morally complex and emotionally difficult for those who understood its terms. Accepting limited entity activity meant accepting that some children would be sacrificed to maintain the stability that protected everyone else. Fighting more aggressively meant risking escalation that could lead to far greater losses. Dr. Williams spent his final years training a new generation of researchers who would inherit responsibility for monitoring interdimensional threats and maintaining humanity's defensive capabilities. The work required individuals who could process cosmic knowledge without being overwhelmed by it, who could maintain human values while understanding alien perspectives, who could fight inhuman enemies without becoming inhuman themselves. The selection and training process inevitably reminded him of the field trip that had started everything. The journey to Centralia that had exposed a group of 8th graders to knowledge that transformed their lives forever. He was selecting young minds and exposing them to dangerous awareness, preparing them for battles they might not survive against enemies they couldn't fully comprehend. But unlike Dr. Reeves and Mrs. Henderson, Dr. Williams ensured that his students retained their individual agency and human loyalties throughout the training process. They learned about interdimensional threats as preparation for resistance rather than recruitment, as knowledge that would help them protect humanity rather than serve its enemies. The difference was crucial, but sometimes difficult to maintain. The same cosmic awareness that allowed effective resistance to entity influence could also make human concerns seem petty and limited by comparison. Researchers who spent years studying interdimensional phenomena sometimes developed the same detached perspective that characterized entity agents, viewing individual human lives as minor details in cosmic processes beyond normal comprehension. Dr. Williams established psychological monitoring protocols that could detect when researchers were losing their connection to human values and priorities. But the protocols were imperfect, and some individuals inevitably slipped through the screening process to become threats rather than defenders. The possibility that his own institute might be infiltrated by entity agents or influenced researchers was a constant concern that required vigilance and periodically painful decisions to remove personnel whose loyalties had become questionable. The work of defending humanity from interdimensional threats required accepting that some defenders would become enemies and some allies would become victims. The field trip to Centralia had taught its survivors that education could be transformation, and transformation could be destruction or transcendence depending on who controlled the process. Dr. Williams spent his career trying to ensure that human consciousness remained under human control, even when that consciousness had to be expanded beyond normal human limitations to face threats that existed beyond normal human experience. His final report to Sarah's Institute acknowledged the ongoing nature of the interdimensional threat, while expressing cautious optimism about humanity's ability to manage it indefinitely. "We have learned to coexist with forces that once threatened our extinction," he wrote. "The entities that seek to harvest human consciousness remain active, but they have been constrained to levels of activity that our defensive networks can monitor and counter. Future generations will inherit a world where interdimensional threats are a permanent reality rather than an existential crisis. They will need to maintain the vigilance and capabilities we have developed while adapting to new challenges that we cannot foresee. The entities we face are ancient and patient, and they will continue evolving their methods as we evolve our defenses. But humanity has proven itself capable of learning, adapting, and surviving contact with intelligences that operate according to principles beyond our natural understanding. We are no longer the naive species that stumbled unknowingly into interdimensional conflict 30 years ago. We have become something stronger, wiser, and more capable of protecting our own consciousness from external manipulation. The price of this strength has been measured in individual lives, human innocence, and the peace of mind that comes from believing that reality is simple and comprehensible. But the alternative would have been the loss of human consciousness as an independent force in the universe, the transformation of our entire species into tools for alien purposes we could never understand. The field trip continues, but now we know where the bus is going and we have some control over who gets to drive. Dr. Williams sealed his final report in the same vault where Sarah had stored her research, adding his conclusions to the archive of human knowledge about interdimensional threats and defense strategies. The vault would remain accessible to future researchers who inherited responsibility for monitoring and countering entity activity, but its contents would never be released to the general public. The knowledge contained in those reports was too dangerous for widespread distribution, too difficult for untrained minds to process safely, and too likely to provoke panic or disbelief among people who lacked the background to understand its implications. Protecting humanity from interdimensional threats required protecting most humans from knowledge of those threats. The secrecy was necessary but troubling, creating a situation where humanity's defenders operated with information that the people they protected couldn't access or verify. The potential for abuse was obvious, and safeguards were built into the monitoring system to prevent the defensive network from becoming a tool for human oppression rather than interdimensional resistance. But the safeguards were imperfect, and the temptation to use cosmic knowledge for terrestrial purposes was constant. Researchers who understood how consciousness could be manipulated by interdimensional entities also understood how it could be influenced by human agencies using similar techniques. The line between defending human minds and controlling them was sometimes uncomfortably thin. The field trip that had started with 32 eighth graders boarding a school bus had evolved into a permanent expedition that encompassed researchers, educators, government agents, and others who'd accepted responsibility for protecting human consciousness from threats that most people couldn't imagine. The expedition had no clear destination and no definite endpoint, only the ongoing mission of maintaining human cognitive independence in a universe where more powerful intelligences sought to co-opt or eliminate that independence. The passengers on this extended field trip would never return to the innocence they'd possessed before learning about interdimensional threats. They would spend their lives in a state of heightened awareness, constantly alert for signs of entity activity, permanently changed by knowledge that separated them from the rest of humanity, even as they worked to protect it. But they would also carry forward the lessons learned through decades of contact with cosmic intelligence. That human consciousness was worth defending, that individual agency was worth preserving, and that curiosity and learning could be tools for resistance as well as transformation. The permission slip for humanity's future had been signed by every person who chose to remain human in the face of offers to become something else. The signature might be written in knowledge that was dangerous to possess, understanding that was costly to maintain, and vigilance that was exhausting to sustain. But it was a human signature, made by human choice, in service of human values that transcended the limited perspective of individual consciousness, while remaining rooted in the lived experience of beings who called Earth home and intended to keep it that way. The field trip continued, carrying its passengers toward discoveries that would challenge everything they thought they knew about reality, consciousness, and the place of human intelligence in a universe far stranger and more dangerous than they had ever imagined. But as long as some passengers remembered where they came from and why the journey mattered, there was hope that the trip would end with humanity still recognizably human, still capable of choosing its own destination, instead of accepting one chosen by entities that viewed human consciousness as nothing more than a convenient tool for purposes that existed beyond human comprehension or concern. The bus was still moving, the road ahead was still uncertain, and the final destination remained unknown. But the passengers had learned to read the map, understand the dangers, and take some control over their own journey through realities that existed far beyond the familiar boundaries of the world they'd thought they knew. And in that learning, in that growth, in that hard-won wisdom, there was hope that the field trip that had begun with innocent curiosity about coal mining might eventually end with something that could still be called human consciousness returning safely home. If this terrifying tale of interdimensional horror disguised as education has left you questioning every field trip your children have ever taken, you're not alone. The boundary between learning and indoctrination, between expanding minds and harvesting them, may be thinner than we dare to imagine. Have you ever wondered what really happens during those overnight school trips to remote locations? What credentials do you actually verify for the expert guides who lead children into underground spaces? Share your own unsettling experiences with educational field trips in the comments below. But remember, some knowledge comes with a price, and if this story has opened your eyes to possibilities you'd rather not consider, hit that subscribe button to stay informed about the hidden dangers lurking in places we trust most. Because in a world where consciousness itself can become a battlefield, ignorance is not bliss, it's vulnerability waiting to be exploited.